The scoreboard read 1,400 yards, wind 18 knots, one shot, one bullseye. Nobody laughed at first. Nobody could. Then they saw who was holding the rifle, a logistics clerk, faded uniform. No rank worth mentioning, a woman who spent her days counting ammunition boxes and filing inventory reports while the real operators trained for war. The laughter came hard and fast after that. Chief Instructor Mason Drake walked the length of the range like a man who had already decided how this story ended. He pressed a single round into her palm, leaned close, and said what everyone was thinking. "Prove it." She didn't argue, didn't flinch, just turned back toward the line. Nobody was ready for what happened next. If you're new here, subscribe now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and don't go anywhere, because this is only the beginning. The shot had already happened before anyone knew to pay attention. That was the thing nobody could quite reconcile afterward. Not the accuracy of it, not the distance, not even the conditions. What bothered them most was the silence that preceded it. No announcement, no request for lane clearance, just a single, clean report rolling out across the high desert like distant thunder. And then the electronic target board at the far end of Lane 7 flickering to life with a bullseye score nobody had posted in 11 weeks. Black Ridge Naval Precision Center sat 43 miles from the nearest town worth naming, carved into a stretch of Nevada high desert where the wind came from 3 directions at once, and the sun had a particular talent for making everything look slightly unreal by early afternoon. The facility ran 3 active training cycles simultaneously: close quarters, tactical movement, and long-range precision. The long-range lanes were the crown of the operation. Lane 7 was the crown of the crown, 1,400 yards. Target array that rotated randomly. Ambient wind corrections that shifted every 90 seconds based on sensors mounted at 4 points along the berm. A course designer somewhere in Coronado had apparently built it specifically to humble people. It was working. The last confirmed bullseye at full distance had come from Senior Chief Okafor 11 weeks prior, and Okafor had been running precision rotations for 9 years. So when the board lit up with a perfect score, center mass, no deviation recorded, the 2 range safety officers stared at the readout for a long moment before either one spoke. "Run the diagnostics," said Petty Officer Second Class Danny Rourke, not because he thought it was a malfunction, but because he needed someone to tell him it wasn't. The diagnostics came back clean. Rourke keyed his radio. "Control, this is range 7. We're showing a full score impact at 1,400. Can you confirm shooter in lane?" A pause. "Range 7, we show no scheduled shooter in lane 7. Lane is marked maintenance hold." Rourke looked at his partner, Specialist Hines, who was already walking toward the firing position with her hand on her sidearm out of nothing more than professional habit. The lane was technically off limits that afternoon. A routine armory inspection had required 2 of the long-range rifles to be removed from storage, function-tested, and returned. Standard procedure, boring procedure. The kind of work that got handed to whoever was at the bottom of the day's task list. Hines reached the covered firing position first. She stopped. Standing behind the rifle, a 3 Lapua Magnum system, mounted on a portable bipod with a spotting scope resting beside it, was a woman Hines had seen around the base for the better part of 4 months without ever once learning her name. She wore a faded utility uniform with logistics branch tape above the left breast pocket. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Her dark hair was pulled back with something that looked like a piece of paracord. She was in the process of clearing the rifle when Hines arrived. Bolt back, chamber inspection, methodical. And she looked up when she heard footsteps without any particular alarm in her expression. "Who authorized you to fire in this lane?" Hines asked. The woman set the rifle down carefully, butt stock to the deck, before she answered. "Function test protocol. I needed to verify the firing mechanism was cycling properly after the armory inspection. I had range safety approval for a single-round function verification." "That's a function test round at 1,400 yards hitting center bullseye." The woman glanced at the target board briefly, then back at Hines. "The wind was reading about 16 knots out of the northwest when I fired. I adjusted." Hines stared at her. "You adjusted?" "Yes, Specialist." "Your name?" "Vale. Petty Officer Second Class, Logistics, Armory Division." Hines radioed it in. "Hotbat." By the time Chief Instructor Mason Drake arrived at Lane 7, there were 14 people clustered around the firing position, and the number was growing. Word had traveled the way it always did on a precision range: fast, distorted, and impossible to contain once it started. Drake heard 3 different versions of the story on his way across the gravel path from the instructor shack, and none of them quite agreed on the details, which told him something significant had actually happened. He was a large man, Drake, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had seen too many Nevada summers and not enough shade. He had 17 years in naval special warfare and a reputation for being exactly as difficult as the situation required. No more, no less. He ran Black Ridge's precision program with the kind of controlled aggression that produced results and burned through instructors at a steady rate. He parted the crowd without asking anyone to move and stood at the edge of the firing position, looking at the target board, then at the rifle, then at the woman standing a few feet to the side with her hands at her waist. He took his time. "Walk me through what happened," he said finally. The woman, Vale, the name tape said, described it plainly. Function test. Single round. She had chambered it, settled behind the rifle to verify the bolt cycle would be smooth under pressure, and fired downrange. She named the wind conditions, the approximate temperature, the scope magnification she had used. Drake listened to all of it. "You're telling me you sat down behind a rifle you'd never fired before, on a course that's been eating operators alive for 11 weeks, and put a round into center mass at 1,400 yards during a function test." "I wasn't trying to hit the target specifically," she said. "I just wasn't going to fire a round into dirt if there was a legitimate aiming point available." Someone in the crowd laughed, then a few more. "That's some story," said Lieutenant Commander Phelps from near the back, the amusement clear in his voice. Drake didn't laugh. He studied her face instead. She wasn't performing calm, that was the thing. Some people, when they were nervous and trying to hide it, had a particular quality of stillness, the kind you could see through if you knew what to look for. This wasn't that. She looked the same way a person looks when they're waiting for a bus. Present, patient, mildly interested in the outcome. He reached into the chest pocket of his instructor vest and removed a single round. He held it out. "Then you won't mind doing it again." A genuine silence fell. The laughter evaporated. People looked at each other. Vale looked at the round in his hand. Then she took it. "I'll need a moment to recheck the scope 0, she said. "Take all the time you need," Drake said. He stepped back and folded his arms. She took 4 minutes. Not 4 minutes of visible preparation. That was the part that started eating at people. She spent about 90 seconds with her eye to the spotting scope, reading the wind flags mounted at 3 intervals along the berm. She made 2 small adjustments to the scope turrets, tiny fractions of elevation and windage, clicking them with the same detached attention someone might give to adjusting a car mirror. Then she spent the remaining time simply lying behind the rifle, breathing. The crowd had grown to 22 people by the time she fired. Chief Drake was watching the target board. He'd positioned himself where he could see both, the board and her, in a single field of view. He wanted to watch the shot break, see the board register, and see her reaction in the same moment. The shot broke so cleanly that half the crowd didn't fully register it had happened until the board lit up. Another perfect bullseye. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Someone said, very quietly, "What the hell?" Drake didn't say anything yet. He walked forward to the firing position, crouched beside the rifle, and looked at the scope settings she'd dialed in. He pulled out his phone and ran the ballistic math for those conditions. The numbers matched. Exactly. He stood up slowly. "Carry on," he said to nobody in particular, and walked back toward the instructor shack. I was in his office for less than 5 minutes when Commander Vivian Cross appeared in the doorway. Cross ran the training command side of Black Ridge. The scheduling, the certification standards, the political relationship with the Naval Special Warfare Command that funded the facility. She was 3 years younger than Drake, considerably more polished, and they had the particular kind of working relationship that was professionally functional and personally brittle. "I heard there was an incident on Lane 7, she said. "I wouldn't call it an incident. A logistics clerk fired on the precision course during a maintenance window." "Yes." "And hit the target." "Twice." Cross looked at him steadily. "Mason. She's got the mechanics, Vivian. I don't know where she got them, but she's got them. She's armory inventory. She checks out rifles and checks them back in and files the paperwork." I know what her billet says. Then you understand why this needs to be addressed. If we let support staff start wandering onto precision courses during maintenance windows, we've got a serious safety documentation problem regardless of the outcome. Drake picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. I want to run her through the standard assessment battery. Cross shook her head. That course is for certified operators in active training rotations, not for, I know what the course is for. A beat of silence. Run your assessment, Cross said finally. Document everything. When it turns out to be a fluke, we close the matter cleanly. She paused at the door. And keep it off the formal log until we know what we're dealing with. She left without waiting for a response. Drake found Vale in the armory 30 minutes later, returning the rifles to their storage racks. She had already cleaned both weapons, which was not technically required as part of the function test protocol, but was apparently something she did anyway. Tomorrow morning, 0600, he said. Lane 7, I want you to run the standard precision assessment. She looked up from the rifle she was racking. Am I in trouble? Should you be? She considered the question with what looked like genuine thought. I followed the function test protocol. I had range officer clearance for a single round. You're not in trouble, Drake said. I just want to see what you can do. She nodded slowly. 0600. I'll be there. Bring your own data card if you have one. She paused for a fraction of a second. I have one. He noticed the pause. He didn't comment on it. She was there at 5:50, which told him something. She had her own data card, a small weathered notebook, not one of the laminated commercial cards that operators usually carried, but an actual notebook with handwritten ballistic tables that had been worked and reworked until the pages were faintly wrinkled with erasure marks. He caught a glimpse of it before she tucked it away. The notations were detailed and precise in a way that took either very good training or a very long time to develop. The assessment Drake had built for the precision course wasn't the standard naval marksmanship qualification. That would have been too simple to be meaningful. He had designed it himself over 3 years as a way of separating shooters who were technically proficient from shooters who could actually think. It ran in 6 stages. Stage 1, static target, known distance, 3 rounds to establish baseline. Stage 2, unknown distance target, shooter must estimate range without equipment. Stage 3, moving target at variable speed, 2-round engagement. Stage 4, wind problem. He changed the conditions using the range's electronic wind system, forcing the shooter to read and correct mid-session. Stage 5, time compressed, full engagement sequence in under 45 seconds. Stage 6, a problem he didn't brief in advance, which that morning was a scenario where the primary scope failed and the shooter had to transition to iron sights or a backup optic. Drake had run this assessment on 43 people over 3 years. 7 had completed all 6 stages to standard. Okafor was one. A DevGru chief petty officer named Hartley was another. He ran Vale through stage 1 without comment, just watching through his own spotting scope. She fired 3 rounds. The group was tight enough that he had to look twice to confirm it was 3 separate impacts. Stage 2. He pointed her at a target at an unmarked distance. Range estimate and engagement. She sat back from the scope, looked at the target with the naked eye, then through a small monocular she pulled from her breast pocket. She was quiet for about 20 seconds. 850, give or take 15, she said. The actual distance was 847 yards. She fired. Hit. Drake wrote something in his notebook. Beside him, Petty Officer Rourke, who had been pulled in as the range safety for the assessment, exhaled quietly through his nose. Stage 3, moving target. It was a steel silhouette on a track system that Drake could control with a remote, varying the speed and direction. He ran it at moderate pace first, then changed speed mid-traverse without warning. She tracked it, led it by what looked like the right amount, and fired at the moment the speed changed. The round hit the target's edge, not center, but a solid impact. Wind shifted on me, she said without being asked. I was late adjusting. Drake hadn't even registered the wind shift. He checked his monitor. She was right. A 3-knot gust from the south had lasted about 1.5 seconds during her trigger pull. She'd felt it. Stage 4. He ran the electronic wind system up to 22 knots from a west-southwest heading, a condition that turned the range into something close to uncomfortable. Most shooters spent 2 to 3 minutes working through their data book to recalculate. Vale sat behind the rifle, made scope adjustments, and looked up at the flags for about 45 seconds. Then she fired. Hit. You didn't recalculate, Drake said. I didn't need to. You had the numbers already. She didn't answer directly. The flags told me what I needed. He looked at her for a moment, then moved on. Stage 5, the time-compressed problem. She ran the full engagement sequence, acquire, range, calculate, engage, in 31 seconds. The standard was 45. Okafor's record was 38. She shaved 7 seconds off his record without appearing to hurry. Then Drake paused the assessment. He stepped away from the spotting scope and just stood there for a moment, looking down the range. Rourke was very quiet beside him. The desert wind moved between them. Stage 6, Drake said. He walked to her firing position and made a small, precise adjustment to the scope mount, a barely visible change that would shift the scope off at 0 without being immediately obvious. It was a test he'd used twice before. Once the shooter discovered the problem, the question was what they did next. Did they panic? Did they demand a replacement? Did they try to compensate without fixing the root cause? He stepped back. Final stage. Standard engagement at 1150 yards. Vale settled behind the rifle. She went through her pre-shot routine. Then she stopped. She pulled back from the scope. She looked at the mount. She ran her finger along the adjustment ring with a light touch, feeling something. She looked up at him. The zero's been moved. Has it? She held his gaze for a second. Then she reached into her breast pocket and pulled out a small tool, a 1/4-inch Allen wrench, and spent 40 seconds returning the scope to its original position. She confirmed the zero by dry firing on the target and reading the scope image. Then she re-engaged. Hit. Drake closed his notebook. He didn't speak for a long time. Rourke was looking at him with an expression that seemed to be waiting for some kind of official categorization, some box they could put this in that would make it make sense. Who are you? Rourke said, not rudely, just genuinely. Vale was clearing the rifle. She didn't look up right away. Logistics, she said. Armory division. Rourke looked at Drake. Drake looked at the target board, still displaying the final impact point. He had been doing this for 17 years. He had seen exceptional shooters. He had trained some of them. And there was a quality in exceptional shooting, not just in the scores, but in the manner, the economy of movement, the quality of attention, that he recognized the same way you recognize a language you've heard before without knowing where. He recognized it now. And it raised a question he couldn't answer from the inside of this facility, which meant he was going to have to make some calls that Vivian Cross was not going to enjoy. The calls came back faster than he expected, which was itself a kind of answer. He had put in requests to 2 different people, a Navy personnel contact in Millington and an old colleague at the Naval Special Warfare Group headquarters in Coronado. Standard background verification. The kind of thing that usually came back in 3 to 5 business days with a file summary attached. He got a response from Millington in 4 hours. The response was 4 words, record restricted, do not inquire. He stared at that for a long time. The response from Coronado came 90 minutes later. It was from his contact directly, which was unusual. His contact's name was Captain Broward, and Broward had worked personnel assignments in the Special Operations community for 11 years. He was not a man who used informal language in official correspondence. The message he sent was 2 sentences. Mason, don't dig on this one. Trust me. Drake read it twice. Then he read it again. He walked to his window and looked out across the range where, 2 hours earlier, a woman in a faded logistics uniform had disassembled 6 stages of a precision assessment he had built specifically to be unbeatable and walked through all of them like she was returning library books. Don't dig on this one. He had been around long enough to know what that kind of response meant. Not the bureaucratic kind of restricted, where records got sealed for administrative reasons or privacy regulations. The other kind. The operational kind. He sat back down at his desk and tried to figure out how to tell Commander Cross that the woman she had written off as a nuisance that morning was something else entirely, without knowing yet what that something else was. His phone buzzed. A new message, this one from a number he didn't recognize, with a Pentagon area code. Chief Drake, I'll be at Black Ridge tomorrow morning, or 900. Please ensure PO2 Vale is available. This is not a request. Drake set the phone down on the desk. He looked at it. Outside, across the gravel and the wind and the long afternoon shadows of the range facility, Lane 7's target board was still showing Vale's last impact. Dead center. He picked the phone back up and started to type a reply, then stopped, then started again. The reply Drake typed and deleted 3 times before finally sending was 11 words. Understood. She will be available. Please advise on nature of visit. No response came. He sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. The message from the Pentagon number reached Commander Cross's desk through channels Drake hadn't used, which meant someone had gone around him deliberately, which meant the situation was already larger than a single unauthorized lane fire. Cross appeared in his doorway at 1740 with the kind of expression that came from swallowing something unpleasant and deciding to be professional about it. "You got the same notification," Drake said. It wasn't a question. The visitor arrives at 0900. She stepped inside and closed the door, which she didn't usually do. "What did you find when you ran her background?" "Record restricted." Cross was quiet for a moment. "How restricted?" "Coronado told me not to dig." She absorbed that. Cross had been in the Navy long enough to understand the difference between administrative restricted and the other kind. He watched her process it, watched the professional calculation run behind her eyes. What this meant for the facility, for the training command, for the decision she had already made that day. "She said anything to you about her background?" "No," Drake said. "She said she was logistics." "And you believe her?" He didn't answer that directly. "I believe she knows exactly what she is." Cross left without another word, which was unusual for her. She was a woman who generally had the last word. The fact that she didn't this time told him the message from the Pentagon had rattled something loose. Vale ate dinner alone in the base cafeteria that evening, which was not unusual for her. In 4 months at Black Ridge, she had established a pattern of quiet separateness that nobody had paid much attention to because support staff often kept to themselves. The operators trained hard and socialized hard and occupied a gravitational center that everyone else orbited at varying distances. Vale orbited at the maximum distance without being obviously antisocial about it. She chose a table at the back corner, facing the room, and she ate quickly and without apparent enjoyment of the food, which was standard cafeteria fare. Tonight it was some kind of chicken situation over rice that tasted like someone had described a recipe over the phone to a person who had never cooked before. She had a habit, which nobody had noticed because nobody was watching, of sitting with her back to the wall and her eyes tracking the room's entry points at regular intervals. Not nervously, just automatically, the way some people check their phone. Corpsman First Class Andrea Tran noticed, actually. Tran ran the base's medical station, a small operation that handled the routine injuries that came with running a precision combat training facility. She had seen Vale in the cafeteria before, and had the vague awareness of her that people develop about regular presences in a shared space. But that evening, she was getting coffee at the machine near the back wall when she passed close enough to Vale's table to register the hands. Vale had her sleeves rolled up. Still, same as on the range. And along the inside of her left forearm, running from the wrist toward the elbow, at an angle that suggested something that had come from the wrong direction entirely, was a scar that Tron recognized immediately as shrapnel pattern. Not surgical. Not accidental. The kind of scar that came from a pressure wave and fragmentation at close enough range to leave a signature. Tron had done 2 combat deployments as a corpsman. She knew the difference. She kept walking and didn't say anything, but she thought about it for the rest of the evening. What? Morning came with the Santa Ana kicking up from the south, which pushed the ambient temperature 8 degrees above the forecast and drove fine alkaline dust across everything. By 0530, the range facility was running, and by 0600 the word had spread in that informal base rumor way that something significant was happening on Lane 7. Drake had said nothing officially, but he had asked 3 instructors to be present for what he called a skills evaluation. And those 3 instructors had each mentioned it to 2 other people, and those people had mentioned it to others. And by the time Vale arrived at Lane 7 at 5:48, carrying the same rifle she'd used the day before, she'd apparently signed it out specifically, which she was authorized to do as armory staff. There were already 11 people clustered around the range observation area. She looked at them, looked at the rifle, and got to work setting up. Chief Drake arrived at 0600 exactly. Behind him came Lieutenant Commander Phelps, a SEAL instructor named Garrett, who had 12 years in the teams and a justified reputation for being difficult, and 2 junior instructors whose names Vale hadn't learned yet. Commander Cross was not present, which was itself a kind of statement. Garrett walked the length of the firing position slowly, looking at Vale's setup. He had the particular brand of arrogance that came from being genuinely good and knowing it, not the compensatory kind, the earned kind, which was in some ways harder to deal with. "So you're the one who shot the board yesterday," he said. "Yes." "Drake's running you through the assessment?" "He ran me through it yesterday." Garrett looked at Drake. Drake said nothing. Garrett looked back at Vale with a new quality of attention. "What'd you score?" "You'd have to ask Chief Drake." "I'm asking you." She met his eyes without aggression or performance. "I passed all 6 stages." A brief silence. "Okafor's the only one who's passed all 6 stages," Garrett said. "Then I'm the second." Garrett smiled. Not warmly, but with a kind of assessment in it, like he was recalibrating. He stepped back and folded his arms. "All right, let's see it, Bob." Drake had redesigned the morning's assessment specifically because he knew what Vale had already demonstrated, and he wasn't interested in watching a repeat. He wanted to find the edge. Every shooter had one, a condition, a problem, a pressure point where the mechanics started to degrade. Finding it wasn't about humiliation. It was about understanding what he was actually dealing with. He started her on a crosswind problem that was technically outside the standard assessment parameters. 26 knots, variable direction, target at 1,200 yards with a partial concealment barrier that required the shooter to identify the exposure window before engaging. He'd used it twice before. Both times the shooter had taken 3 rounds to find the solution. Vale took 1 round. She held her shot for 47 seconds, while the wind flag's downrange moved through 3 direction shifts, then fired in the quarter-second window between gusts. Dead center. Garrett had stopped talking. That was notable because Garrett rarely stopped talking. Drake moved to the second problem. Moving target, but not a single silhouette, a target array, 3 steel panels mounted on separate tracks moving at different speeds and directions simultaneously. The standard was to engage all 3 in sequence. The actual difficulty was that hitting the second target required the shooter to break from a sight picture that was working, which was psychologically harder than it sounded. Vale engaged all 3. She hit the first 2 cleanly. The third she clipped. Solid impact, not center, but a scoring hit on a man-sized target. She cleared the bolt and said, without being asked, "I rushed the third. The track speed changed when I was transitioning." Drake checked his control tablet. The track had changed speed. He hadn't done it deliberately. The system had a randomization function he'd left active, which sometimes kicked in. She had registered a change he hadn't intentionally introduced. "You tracked the speed change?" he asked. "I felt it in the sight picture. The relative motion shifted." Phelps made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Garrett looked at the target and then at the ground and said nothing. Drake moved to the third problem, and here was where he had designed something new. He had set up a scenario that was less about marksmanship mechanics and more about tactical reasoning. A field problem. A map of a simulated terrain with 3 possible firing positions, a target that would only be exposed for a limited window based on a timed movement sequence, and environmental factors, wind, light angle, vegetation concealment, that made each position viable for different reasons. The shooter was given 5 minutes to select a position and set up. He explained the problem. He handed her the map. She looked at it for about 90 seconds. She asked one question. "What's the soil composition at position 3? Drake blinked. "Why?" "The approach path has a drainage gradient. If the soil is sandy, it'll shift under a bipod leg when the wind gusts. It'll affect point of impact at this distance." Drake looked at the map. He had not included soil composition in the problem design. He had not considered it. In 7 years of running this facility, no one had asked that question. "Assume firm compacted earth," he said, because it was the only honest answer he could give. She nodded and chose position 2. She set up in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She engaged the target at the precise moment the timed exposure window opened. The round hit. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. The wind moved through the range, lifting a low roll of dust along the berm. Somewhere farther down the facility, the sound of an instruction session carried faintly through the air. Someone counting out a cadence, the flat report of smaller caliber fire from the pistol lanes. Garrett took a step forward. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was looking at Vale the way Drake had been looking at her since yesterday, with the particular frustration of a man trying to fit something into a category and finding that none of the available categories were the right size. "Where did you train?" he asked. Vale was clearing the rifle. She ran the bolt twice, checked the chamber, settled the weapon on its stock. "Various places," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." Garrett looked at Drake. Drake was writing in his notebook. He didn't look up. "You don't get to the level you're at without a formal training program," Garrett said to Vale, his voice taking on an edge. "Somebody trained you. Where?" "I've done a lot of independent work." "Nobody independently develops what I just watched." "Then I'm an exception." The word landed flat and final, and Garrett heard the finality in it and didn't push further, which was unusual for him. He stepped back and stood with his arms at his sides, looking at the target board. The tactical planning evolution was Drake's idea and Cross's demand. When Drake had briefed her the previous evening on what he intended to run, Cross had added one requirement. She wanted to see how Vale handled a mission planning scenario. Not execution, planning. The cognitive side. The kind of work that separated operators who were physically exceptional from operators who could actually lead. Cross arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, which was 45 minutes after the shooting assessment concluded. She walked the range perimeter and then came directly to where Drake was debriefing with the instructors. She nodded at Drake, glanced at Vale, and took a position slightly to the side in a way that was technically observational but communicated authority clearly. "Chief Drake tells me you've been impressing people this morning," Cross said. Vale looked at her. "I don't know that I'd characterize it that way, Commander." "How would you characterize it?" "I've been answering questions." Cross held her gaze for a moment. There was something in Cross's expression that was harder to read than irritation. It was closer to the look of someone doing a rapid internal recalculation and not liking the result. "We're going to run a mission planning exercise," Cross said. "I want to watch you think through a problem." The problem Drake set up used the facility's tactical planning room, a windowless space with a sand table in the center, maps on 3 walls, and a whiteboard that Garrett had used earlier in the week for a different training session, still showing fragments of his notes in blue marker. It smelled like dry erase markers and old coffee. The scenario. A 2-person sniper element, compromised, 90 minutes from extraction, with a pursuing force of unknown size moving on their last known position from 2 directions. The extraction point was fixed. The route between current position and extraction crossed 2 terrain features that would require decisions. A ridgeline that offered elevation and concealment, but a longer time exposure, or a creek bed that was faster but channelized and dangerous. Drake gave Vale the scenario card and stepped back. She read it once. She looked at the map for about a minute. Then she started talking. Not the way an instructor talks, building toward a conclusion for the audience's benefit. The way someone thinks out loud when they're actually solving a problem, following a thread, doubling back when the thread led somewhere wrong, making small corrections without embarrassment. "The ridgeline is a trap," she said. "The elevation advantage disappears when the pursuing force splits. If they're trained, one element pins you on the ridge while the other moves to cut the far slope. You're skylined the whole time." She looked at the map. "The creek bed is faster but channelized. You need to get through it before the pursuing force can establish a blocking position at the far end." She traced the route with her finger. "Time. How long from compromise to when the pursuing force reaches the creek's far terminus? Assuming they have vehicles?" Drake checked the scenario card. "Approximately 40 minutes. And the distance through the creek bed? 2 kilometers. She was quiet for a moment. "You can't run 2 kilometers in broken terrain carrying a long gun system in 40 minutes and guarantee a clean exit." She looked up. "You'd have to cache the long gun. Transition to short." "The scenario specifies both operators retain their assigned weapons," Drake said. She looked at him with an expression that wasn't defiance exactly, but wasn't compliance either. "The scenario is asking me to follow a rule that gets both operators killed." Drake said nothing. "In the field, the rule changes when the rule gets you killed," she said. "You cache the rifle, you carry out the critical components, the bolt, the optic, and you get to extraction. The gun is replaceable. The element isn't." Garrett, standing at the room's edge, made a quiet sound. Not disagreement. something closer to recognition. Cross had her arms folded. She was watching Vale with the focused attention of someone who has stopped looking for a flaw and started looking at the thing itself. "You've had to make that call before," Cross said. It wasn't a question. Vale met her eyes. "It's a logical solution to the problem." "That's not what I asked." A pause. The kind of pause that has history in it. "The question was about the scenario," Vale said. Cross held the silence for 2 more seconds, then nodded. "Continue." Quote. The debrief ran 40 minutes, and by the end of it, the room had a different atmosphere than it had started with. Not warmer, exactly, but more careful. The kind of careful that comes from recognizing you are in the presence of something that requires more attention than you initially allocated. Garrett walked out ahead of the others and caught up with Drake in the corridor. "The soil composition question," Garrett said. "I know. I've run that problem 6 times. Nobody's asked that." "I know." Garrett looked at the ceiling briefly. "She said the rule changes when the rule gets you killed." "I heard it." "That's not textbook, that's experience." Drake stopped walking. He turned to look at Garrett. "I know." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "So what do we do?" "Tomorrow someone from the Pentagon arrives at 0900, Drake said. "We wait and see what they tell us." "And if they don't tell us anything?" Drake started walking again. "Then we keep asking questions until someone gets uncomfortable." The afternoon brought a different kind of test, and it wasn't Drake's idea. 3 of the junior operators, men in the training rotation who had watched the morning session from a distance and processed it through the particular filter of competitive pride, found Vale at the armory during the midday equipment cycle. Their presence there wasn't entirely accidental. They had waited until the senior instructors were at lunch and the facility was in its quieter midday rhythm. Their leader was a Navy SEAL candidate named Ritter, Petty Officer First Class, 18 months from completing a selection pipeline, with the kind of physical confidence that came from being routinely the strongest and fastest person in any room. He was not a bad man. He was a young man, which is a different category entirely, and he was unsettled by something he couldn't explain. "Can I help you with something?" Vale said. She was at the cleaning station, working through a routine inspection of 3 sidearms that had been returned from the range. "Just checking something out," Ritter said. He leaned against the counter with the studied casualness of someone who has rehearsed this. "You're the one who shot the board yesterday." "Yes." "And again this morning." "Yes." "And then you solved the ridgeline problem in the planning room." "I offered a solution." Ritter looked at his 2 companions briefly. "Here's the thing I keep coming back to. The guys I train with, guys who've been doing this for years, they go through that assessment and most of them come out the other side bleeding. You walk through it like you're filing paperwork. I can't speak to other people's experience. I'm not asking about other people." He straightened off the counter. "I'm asking about yours. Where does someone like you learn to shoot like that?" "I've answered that question already today. You said various places, which isn't an answer. It's the answer you're going to get." Ritter took a step closer. Not aggressive, but deliberate. "You know what I think? I think you got lucky twice on a range that was running at reduced capacity, and somebody's getting very excited about nothing." Vale set down the sidearm she was inspecting. She placed it with care, barrel pointed away from everyone. She looked at Ritter with the same quality of calm attention she'd brought to every moment since yesterday morning, the same way the desert floor looks calm right before a flash flood. "If that's what you think," she said, "then you don't have a question. You have a conclusion." Ritter blinked. He hadn't expected that. "And if you're looking for someone to be upset by your conclusion," she continued, "I'm not available for that right now." She picked up the next sidearm. "Was there something you needed from the armory?" Ritter stood there for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not quite embarrassment, but adjacent to it, the kind of feeling that comes from preparing a confrontation and finding that the other person simply declined to participate. He left. His companions followed. Vale cleared the sidearms chamber, checked the barrel, set it in the inspection tray. She worked through the remaining 2 weapons in silence. Corpsman Tran found Drake at the end of the afternoon, catching him at the instructor's shack as he was locking up for the day. She had spent most of the day thinking about the scar she'd seen the previous evening and deciding whether it was her business. She'd concluded that in her professional capacity, it probably was. "The woman from Lane 7, she said. "Vale." Drake looked at her with the careful attention of a man who had spent 2 days collecting fragments of a picture he couldn't quite see yet. "You've seen something," he said. "Shrapnel scarring on her left forearm. Old. At least several years." Tran paused. "The pattern and angle. It's consistent with a close-range IED or a fragmentation device. She was inside the effective casualty radius." Drake said nothing. "I did 2 tours as a combat corpsman," Tran continued. "I know the difference between the kind of injury that happens in a controlled environment and the kind that happens when things go wrong in a very specific way. You're saying she was in combat. I'm saying she's carrying the physical evidence of it." Tran paused again. "I don't know what she's doing here. That's not my business. But I thought you should know what I saw." Drake thanked her. He stood at the door of the instructor shack for a while after she left, watching the sun come down over the berm in the way it did in the Nevada desert, fast and final, leaving the sky briefly that specific shade of orange that didn't quite look real. He thought about the 4 words from Millington. Record restricted. Do not inquire. He thought about Broward's 2 sentences from Coronado. He thought about the soil composition question and the way she had said the rule changes when the rule gets you killed with the particular flatness of a person reporting a fact they had already paid for. He went back inside and wrote 3 more pages of notes, more detailed than anything he'd written in months, and when he was done, he sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Pentagon liaison arriving in the morning. Then he thought about something else, a smaller detail that had been sitting at the back of his attention since the planning room exercise. When Cross had asked, "You've had to make that call before," Vale had paused for exactly the length of time it takes to decide not to answer a question honestly, not to construct a lie, just to decide what to withhold. Drake knew that pause. He'd used it himself, in rooms where the honest answer was classified. He picked up his phone and looked at the Pentagon number again. Then he opened his laptop and ran a search that he knew was probably pointless. Logistics personnel records were public, but they were also thin. What came back was exactly what he expected. Petty Officer 2nd Class Aaron Vale, assigned to Black Ridge Naval Precision Center. Logistics Armory Division. Reporting date 14 weeks prior. Before that, a brief administrative gap. Before that, a posting at a naval facility in Virginia that Drake happened to know functioned as a support command for special operations activities. Virginia. Administrative gap. Black Ridge. The pattern didn't prove anything, but patterns didn't have to prove things. They just had to point. Drake closed the laptop. Tomorrow at 0900, someone from the Pentagon was going to walk through the gate of this facility and either answer his questions or make them worse. Either way, the morning was going to change something. He was already certain of that much. What he was not certain of, what he could not quite bring himself to land on, even after 2 days of accumulating evidence, was the scope of what he'd been underestimating. Because there was a version of this where Vale was an exceptionally trained operator who had requested a quiet posting for reasons he could imagine but not confirm, and there was another version where she was something rather more than that. Both versions had a problem in common. Both of them meant that every person in this facility who had laughed yesterday morning, and there had been a significant number of them, had made an error that went well beyond the professional. Drake turned off the light and drove back to his quarters in the dark, and the desert night was very quiet around him, and he found that he had nothing comfortable left to think about. The Pentagon liaison arrived at 0850, 10 minutes early, which told Drake something about the person before he saw the vehicle. The car was a dark gray government sedan, no markings, rental plates, and it came through the main gate without stopping because whoever was in it had pre-cleared with base security the night before, which meant they had made calls Drake didn't know about to people Drake hadn't spoken to. I was standing outside the instructor shack when it pulled up, coffee in hand, and he watched a man in civilian clothes step out. Middle 50s, short gray hair, the kind of physical bearing that didn't come from a gym, but from years of carrying weight in difficult places. The man looked at Drake across the gravel with the evaluating attention of someone who had already read his file. "Chief Drake?" "That's right." "Agent Whitfield, I'm attached to a DoD oversight unit. I won't give you a card because the card would raise more questions than it answers." He looked past Drake at the facility. "Where is she?" "Armory doesn't open until 0700. She'll be there." "Take me." They walked the facility in Swansons. Whitfield looked at things the way an inspector looks, not at the obvious features, but at the margins. The distance between buildings, the security camera coverage gaps, the sight lines from various positions. Drake watched him do it and said nothing, but he filed it. The armory was a low concrete building at the facility's eastern edge, separated from the main training complex by a gravel access road and a chain-link perimeter. Vale was inside when they arrived, behind the counter, running the morning check-in log. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at her. Something passed between them that Drake could not read. Not recognition exactly, but the particular quality of two people who have operated in the same world and can identify it in each other, the way veterans sometimes identify each other in civilian spaces without being able to articulate why. "Good morning," Vale said. "Good morning, Petty Officer." Whitfield came to the counter. "I need about an hour of your time. You'll need to clear it with the duty officer." "It's cleared." She looked at Drake. Drake gave her a small nod. She closed the check-in log, came around the counter, and that was that. Drake started to follow. Whitfield turned and looked at him with a polite and immovable expression. "Just the two of us for now, Chief." Drake stopped. He wanted to argue. He didn't. He stood at the armory door and watched them walk away across the gravel. Whitfield speaking in a low voice, and Vale listening with her hands at her sides and her head slightly forward, the posture of someone receiving information rather than delivering it. They went into the base conference room. The door closed. Drake drank his coffee. It had gone cold. Commander Cross found him 40 minutes later at the range office, staring at a ballistics chart he wasn't actually reading. "Anything?" she said. "They're still inside." Cross sat down across from him. She had a folder that she set on the table but didn't open. "I made some calls last night." "To who?" "People I know in the personnel command. Not about the record. I knew that was a wall. About the posting history. The administrative gap before she arrived here." She tapped the folder. "The gap is 14 months. 14 months of nothing. No posting, no TDY record, no medical, no administrative activity of any kind." Drake looked at the folder. "People don't disappear from the administrative record for 14 months without a reason," Cross said. "Either they're out, discharged, separated, or they're somewhere the record doesn't follow." "Or both," Drake said. Cross opened the folder. Inside was a single printed page, a standard personnel summary, mostly redacted. Long black bars covered the assignment history. The name and service number were intact. Below them, in the bio section, a single unredacted line that someone had apparently missed when they ran the document through the classification review. It read, "Maritime Special Operations Qualified. Last confirmed operational assignment." The rest was blacked out. Drake read the unredacted line twice. Then he read it again. "Maritime Special Operations," he said. "That's not a support billet," Cross said. "No. That's not someone who ended up in a logistics role because they couldn't do anything else." "No," Drake said again. He set the page down and looked at the ceiling. "That's someone who chose it." The room was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Cross said, and the question was genuine. Not rhetorical, not pointed, but the honest confusion of a person trying to understand a choice they couldn't map onto any framework they had. "I don't know yet," Drake said. Vale came out of the conference room at 0958. She came out alone, which meant Whitfield was still inside, either making calls or waiting for something. She walked across the facility with the same unhurried pace she always used, and Drake fell in beside her without planning to. "How was it?" he said. "Fine." "That's not information." "It wasn't meant to be." He walked with her in silence for a moment. The morning had gotten warm, the Santa Ana was still working, pushing grit across everything, and the sun was already high enough to make the gravel shimmer at the edges of his vision. "The unredacted line in your personnel file says Maritime Special Operations Qualified," Drake said. She didn't break stride. She didn't look at him. "Administrative error," she said. "Vivian Cross found it. She's not going to treat it as an administrative error. Then she can file a query with the personnel command." Vale paused at the armory door. "Which will come back restricted." "She knows that." "Then I'm not sure what the conversation accomplishes." She went inside. Drake stood at the door for a moment, then followed her. "Erin." He hadn't used her first name before. It surprised him too. I'm not trying to expose you. I'm trying to understand what's happening in my facility. She was behind the counter again, reopening the check-in log. She looked up at him. He had the distinct impression for the first time that she was tired. Not from the morning, not from the physical work, but from something older than that. What's happening in your facility, she said carefully, is that a function test produced an unexpected result, and it's been 2 days and everyone is still looking at it. Because the result doesn't have an explanation that fits. It has the explanation I gave you. Aaron. She closed the log again, set her hands flat on the counter, looked at him directly, and there was something in her eyes that was neither hostile nor warm. It was the look of a person deciding how honest to be and concluding that the answer is less than they'd like. Chief Drake, she said, I appreciate what you're doing. I think you're a decent man. But there are things I can't tell you, and asking me the same question in different ways isn't going to change that. Drake held her gaze. Agent Whitfield tell you to say that? Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, exactly. No, I've been saying it my whole career. He left it there. But he carried it with him for the rest of the morning, the specific weight of a near answer, Sab. The situation broke open at 1300, and it broke open because of Ritter, Petty Officer First Class Ritter, had spent the morning in close quarters training, which he was genuinely excellent at, and which had done nothing to resolve the particular irritation that had been sitting in his chest since the armory the previous afternoon. He had told himself it didn't matter, and telling himself that had not helped, and by lunchtime it had fermented into something less rational than irritation. He found 2 of his rotation partners, Kowalski and a newer operator named Fenn, and the 3 of them went to the range observation area where Vale was running a routine equipment inventory on the precision rifles that had been used that morning. It was a visible spot, which was possibly deliberate. Ritter had the specific energy of someone who wanted an audience. Hey, he stopped at the edge of the observation area. Vale. She looked up from the inventory sheet. I want to ask you something directly. You can ask. He came forward. Kowalski and Fenn positioned themselves slightly behind him, not aggressively but not neutrally either. The assessment yesterday, the planning room this morning, Whitfield showing up and pulling you out for an hour. I want to know what's actually going on. I'm doing an inventory. I'm not asking about the inventory. I know. She set the clipboard down on the rifle case. What are you actually asking? I'm asking if you're some kind of plant. Someone sent in to test how the facility responds to an anomalous situation. She looked at him for a moment. Why would someone do that? Evaluation of instructor response. Test for bias. There's been programs like that? You think I was sent here to embarrass you? I think something is going on that nobody is being straight about. Vale looked at the range, looked back at Ritter. Petty Officer Ritter, I'm a logistics specialist. I did a function test. The round hit the target. Everything since then has been other people's reaction to that. You've got a restricted record. That landed. He watched her face for a tell. He didn't find one. A lot of people have restricted records, she said. It's not unusual in this community. You're not in this community, you're in armory inventory. Which is where I work, yes. So why is your record restricted? She picked up the clipboard again. I'd refer you to the personnel command. Ritter took another step forward. He was a big man, 6'2", 220, the kind of person for whom physical presence was a tool he'd learned to deploy since adolescence. It didn't always work as a conscious choice. Sometimes it was just how he moved when he was frustrated. I don't think you're what you say you are, he said. His voice was lower now, flatter. And I don't like operating in a facility where someone isn't what they say they are. Vale looked at his face, then at the distance between them, then back at his face. Step back, she said. The words were quiet. Not loud, not aggressive, but they had a quality of absolute conviction that made Kowalski take a half step backward without being addressed. Ritter didn't move. I'm serious, Ritter said. So am I, Vale said. Step back. He reached forward and put his hand on her arm. Not violently, but firmly, the way someone does when they want to establish physical authority over a conversation. He had done it before without thinking. It usually worked. What happened next took approximately 1.5 seconds. She turned into the grip rather than away from it, redirecting his elbow outward with her left hand while her right palm came up under his forearm at the pressure point above the wrist. The leverage was minimal and precise. No wasted movement, no show, just a specific application of force that broke his grip and rotated his arm into a position where continuing forward would damage his own shoulder. He stopped without deciding to. His body stopped before his brain could vote. She released him immediately, stepped back to her original position, picked up the clipboard. The whole thing had been so fast and so quiet that Fenn, standing slightly behind and to the right, wasn't entirely certain what he'd seen. Ritter stood very still. His arm felt strange. Not painful, she hadn't hurt him, but wrong in the way something feels when it's been briefly outside its intended range of motion. He looked at his hand. He looked at Vale. She was already reading the inventory sheet. "You want to file a complaint," she said. "The duty officer's in the main building." Ritter stood there for another moment. Then he left, and Kowalski and Fenn went with him, and none of them said anything on the way back across the gravel. The complaint reached Drake's desk at 14:20. He read it again, and then walked to Cross's office and handed it to her without comment. Cross read it, set it on her desk. "She broke his grip and released," Cross said. "That's not an assault." "No. That's a defensive response to unwanted physical contact." "Yes." Cross looked at the complaint. "Ritter initiated contact. His account says he placed a hand on her arm to get her attention." "And her response?" "Technically appropriate. No injury, immediate release, no escalation." Drake paused. "The technique was precise." Cross looked up. "How precise?" "The kind of precise that takes years of specific training." He paused again. "CQC, close quarters control. Not the basic self-defense package they run through standard training rotations. The specific application she used, it's from a curriculum I've only seen in 2 places. Combatives instruction at SEAL team level and a program that runs out of the Joint Special Operations Training pipeline at Fort Bragg." Cross sat back in her chair. "She's not armory inventory," Cross said. The words came out flat, like a fact that had finally been allowed to land after 2 days of hovering. "No. She never was." "I don't think so." Cross was quiet for a moment. Drake could see her assembling something. Not just the individual facts, but the shape of the thing all the facts were pointing toward. He'd been assembling the same shape for 2 days. "I want to talk to her," Cross said. "Today." "Whitfield is still on base. He was in the conference room this morning for nearly an hour." "I don't care about Whitfield." Cross stood up. "Get her." Quote. They met in the range office, which was Drake's territory, and therefore slightly more neutral than Cross's office would have been. Vale came without argument when Drake found her, which was either cooperation or the particular confidence of someone who wasn't afraid of a conversation. Cross was standing when they arrived. She didn't sit down. Drake took a position at the room's edge, which was tacitly his function in this. Not authority, but witness. "Close the door," Cross said. Drake closed it. Cross looked at Vale with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who has decided to dispense with approach and go straight to the thing. "I've spent 2 days watching you demonstrate skills that are not consistent with your assigned billet, your stated training history, or any explanation you've offered." Cross's voice was controlled. "Agent Whitfield arrives from a DOD office and spends an hour with you privately, then leaves without briefing me, the facility commander, on the nature of his visit. Your personnel record is restricted at a level that requires deliberate classification action, not routine privacy protection." She paused. "I want to know who you are." Vale stood with her hands at her waist. Her expression was the same one she'd had on the range 2 days ago. Present, even, neither hostile nor accommodating. "I'm Petty Officer 2nd Class Aaron Vale," she said. "I'm assigned to this facility in a logistics capacity." "That answer isn't working anymore." "It's the answer I have, Commander." Cross took a step forward. "Aaron, I run this facility. I have 200 personnel under my command, many of them in active operational training. If there is a classified presence on this base that I don't know about, that is a security issue and a command issue, and I have the authority to—" "You have the authority to file a query with the Personnel Command," Vale said. "You have the authority to contact the DOD Oversight Unit that Agent Whitfield represents. You have the authority to escalate this up your own chain of command. I'm not obstructing any of that." What you're doing is refusing to answer a direct question from a superior officer. I'm answering within the scope of what I can answer. Something shifted in Cross's posture. A small change, almost imperceptible, but Drake caught it. She stepped closer to Vale, closing the distance in a way that was deliberate and intended to establish something. Her hand came up and she gripped Vale's collar, not violently, but firmly, the way someone does when they want to make unmistakably clear that they are in charge. "Who are you?" Cross said, low and hard. "Tell me right now." What happened was fast, much faster than the Ritter situation, which had been measured and controlled. This was different because the trigger was different. A hand at the collar crossed a specific threshold, and Vale's body responded before any deliberate choice was made. She turned, she redirected, she had Cross's wrist captured and her arm levered into a hold that immobilized without injuring in approximately 2 seconds. It was not the same technique she'd used on Ritter. It was more direct, more final, the kind of control that communicated clearly that the person applying it had decided this ends now. She held it for 1 second. Then she released Cross completely, stepped back, and put space between them. The room was absolutely silent. Cross stood where she was, her arm held slightly out from her body, her expression moving through a rapid sequence. Shock, then something harder than shock, then the particular stillness of a person who has just learned something in a way they cannot unlearn. Drake had not moved from the wall. He was aware of his own heartbeat. Vale's collar had shifted with the movement. The neckline of her utility top had pulled to the side, and on her left shoulder, visible now to both of them in the harsh fluorescent light of the range office, was a tattoo. Small. Faded. The kind of faded that came from years rather than poor application. A stylized insignia that Drake did not recognize immediately, but Cross did. He could tell by the way she stopped breathing. It lasted 2 seconds. Cross recovered, because Cross was good at recovering, and the professional mask came back down. But those 2 seconds were unambiguous. "What is that?" Drake said. He wasn't asking Cross. He was asking Vale. Vale had already pulled her collar back. The tattoo was covered. She didn't answer. The silence in the room was the loudest Drake had experienced inside a building in his 17 years of service. Then his radio crackled. "Chief Drake, this is Gate Security. We have a DoD vehicle convoy requesting entry. 4 vehicles. Lead vehicle is carrying..." A brief pause. "A flag officer, sir. Rear Admiral Hargrove. He's asking for range access. He says he's here to see someone." Drake looked at his radio, then at Vale. Vale was looking at the window, at the small rectangle of Nevada desert visible through the glass, with the expression of a person who has been waiting for something to arrive and is not surprised that it finally has. Drake keyed his radio. "Send them through." He looked at Cross. Cross was still holding her arm slightly out from her body, and she was looking at Vale with an expression that had moved entirely past the professional, and into something more honest than that, the look of a person confronting the specific size of their own mistake. "The tattoo," Drake said quietly. "You recognized it." Cross said nothing for a moment, then, "It's a unit designator. Special operations. The classification level is above what I have clearance for." She paused. "Above what most people in this building have clearance for." Drake sat down, which he almost never did in a standing situation. He sat down because his legs made the decision before he did. "How long ago was it designated?" he said. "That specific insignia?" Cross's voice was very controlled now. "That program ran for about 8 years. It was stood down..." She stopped. "I don't know exactly when it was stood down. The timing wasn't public." 8 years of operations, Drake said. "Confirmed. That I know." He looked at Vale, who was standing by the window with her hands at her waist, looking at the desert. "Erin," he said. She turned. "The Admiral's coming onto the range." "I know," she said. "You know him." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. The first time she'd answered something directly that she didn't have to. "Yes," she said. "I know him." What? The convoy came through the gate in a tight formation that the base security personnel had clearly not been briefed for and were handling with the controlled urgency of people improvising a protocol. 4 vehicles, lead and trail with unmarked sedans, middle 2 carrying the Admiral's party. They stopped at the range perimeter, and Rear Admiral Paul Hargrove stepped out of the second vehicle with the specific kind of unhurried certainty that comes from decades of being the most consequential person in any room. He was 60, maybe slightly past it, with close-cropped silver hair and the lean economic build of a man who had not stopped moving since the last century. He wore his uniform with 4 stars of his rank, not dress, working uniform, the same way he'd apparently decided to make this visit without advance notice. He looked at the range facility the way you look at a place you remember differently. He walked through the main range gate without waiting for someone to open it, which it wasn't locked, so this was mostly a statement. His aide fell in behind him. 2 security personnel flanked at a respectful distance. Drake met him at the entrance to the range office building. Chief Drake. Hargrove shook his hand, firm, brief, the handshake of a man who had given and received enough of them to have reduced it to its functional minimum. I apologize for the short notice. Is she inside? Yes, sir. Cross? Also inside. Good. He looked at Drake for a moment. You've had an interesting couple of days. You could say that, sir. I've read the assessment results. Whitfield forwarded them this morning. He started toward the door. You ran a good battery. That soil composition question, she caught you off guard. Yes, sir. She's been catching people off guard for a long time. He stopped at the door and looked at Drake with direct, unambiguous eyes. Whatever was said to her in this facility, whatever was done, I want to hear it from you straight before I go in, Drake told him. He kept it short and specific. The laughter on the range the first day, the comments from the operators, Ritter's confrontation in the armory, Cross's confrontation in the range office. He did not editorialize. He gave the Admiral the facts and let them sit. Hargrove listened to all of it without expression. When Drake was done, the Admiral was quiet for a moment. Cross grabbed her collar, he said. Yes, sir. And Aaron controlled her and released immediately. Yes, sir. Hargrove nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. All right. He went inside. Cross was still in the range office when Hargrove came through the door. She came to attention, not a panicked attention, but the precise, correct posture of a senior officer responding to flag presence in her facility. Whatever else was true about Cross, her professionalism under pressure was real. Commander Cross. Hargrove returned the courtesy with a nod. At ease. He looked at Vale. Vale stood by the window. She was looking at him with something that wasn't easy to name. It wasn't military formality, and it wasn't personal warmth, and it wasn't the careful neutrality she'd maintained for 2 days. It was something that contained all of those things in a complicated arrangement. Hargrove crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He came to a full stop, and he straightened, and he raised a crisp, flawless military salute, not the abbreviated motion that senior officers sometimes used, but a full and deliberate rendering of the gesture, held for a beat longer than protocol required. Master Chief Aaron Vale, he said. His voice was level, but not flat. It's an honor to see you again. The room went entirely still. Drake watched Cross's face. Cross was looking at the Admiral and then at Vale, and doing the rank arithmetic with visible, involuntary effort. Master Chief, not Petty Officer Second Class, not the rank on the name tape, not anything that fit the person she had grabbed by the collar an hour ago. Vale returned the salute. It was precise and quick, and then she dropped it. Admiral, she said, quietly. Hargrove lowered his hand. I was looking at her with the kind of attention that had history in it, not the evaluating attention of a superior assessing a subordinate, but the more complicated attention of someone who had watched someone go through something serious and was checking now on the other side of it. You look like you've been sleeping, he said. Better than I was, she said. Good. He turned and looked at Cross. The shift in his expression was not dramatic, but it was complete. Commander Cross, I'm going to need about 2 hours of your conference room, access to your personnel records for this facility, and a list of every interaction involving Master Chief Vale since her arrival here, starting with the first day on the range 2 days ago. Cross said, Yes, sir, in a voice that had very little air in it. I'll also need coffee. He glanced at Drake. For both of us. Drake said, Yes, sir, went to get it, and on the way out of the room he passed close enough to Vale to see her face clearly for the first time since the Admiral had walked in. She looked exhausted in a way she hadn't looked before, not physically, but the particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining something difficult for a very long time and feeling it, finally, be put down. There was nothing triumphant in it, nothing satisfied, just the specific weight of a person who had been holding a door closed for a long time, and the door had just opened on its own. He got the coffee, he carried it back. And outside on lane 7, in the afternoon glare, the target board was still showing the last score from 2 days ago. A perfect bullseye, nobody's name attached to it. Just the number and the distance and the result. Sitting there in the Nevada heat like a question that had finally started getting answers. The coffee Drake brought back was from the machine in the hallway, which produced something that was technically coffee in the same way that a parking lot was technically real estate. He set 2 cups on the conference table without apology and took a position near the door. Hargrove didn't comment on the coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment, then set it down and opened the folder his aide had brought in from the vehicle. Cross sat across from him. Vale sat to the Admiral's right, which was not where Cross had expected her to sit. She'd expected Vale to take a chair at the table's edge, the deferential positioning of someone in an uncertain situation. Instead, Vale sat where Hargrove had gestured without thinking, and Cross registered that the gesture had been automatic. Drake stayed near the door. Nobody told him to leave, which he chose to interpret as permission to stay. "Commander Cross," Hargrove said, "I'm going to give you some information. Some of it is going to be uncomfortable. I'd appreciate your professional attention throughout." "Yes, sir," Cross said. Master Chief Vale was assigned to this facility under a reduced visibility billet. That's a formal administrative classification. It means the assignment appears in personnel records at the minimum identifying level, without operational history or rank specifics. It's used in circumstances where a service member requires a period of, he paused slightly, operational distance, while remaining within a supportive institutional environment. Cross said nothing. "The decision to use a reduced visibility billet here was mine," Hargrove continued. "I take full responsibility for the information gap it created in your command visibility. That gap was not your failure. It was a deliberate operational decision made above your level." "I understand, sir," Cross said. Her voice was professional. Her hands, flat on the table, were very still. "What I need from you now is a complete and honest account of every interaction involving Master Chief Vale since her arrival. Specifically, any incident in which her authority, competence, or person were treated in a manner inconsistent with her actual standing." He paused. "I'll be compiling this for a formal review. It will affect personnel records." Cross held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she looked at the table. "I dismissed her from the range on the first day," she said. "I implied that the precision course was not an appropriate space for support staff." "Was that before or after she completed the assessment?" "Before the assessment, after the first shot." Cross paused. "And this morning, in the range office, I made physical contact. I grabbed her collar." She did not look at Vale while she said it. She responded defensively and released immediately. "The contact was initiated by me." The room was very quiet. "I see," Hargrove said. "I take full responsibility for that, sir." Hargrove looked at Vale. "Anything to add?" Vale shook her head. "No, sir." "Nothing to add, or nothing you want on the record?" A pause. "She released when I told her to," Vale said. "She didn't escalate, for what it's worth?" Cross looked up at that. Something moved across her face. Not gratitude exactly, but the complicated look of someone receiving a grace they're not sure they deserve. Hargrove ran the debrief for 90 minutes. Drake learned more about Aaron Vale in those 90 minutes than he had assembled in 2 days. And what he learned had the quality of something that reframes everything that came before it. Not because the facts were shocking individually, but because of what they added up to. She had entered the Naval Special Operations pipeline 11 years prior, coming out of a conventional Navy background with a marksmanship record that had flagged her for further evaluation. The evaluation led to a specialized training track. The specialized training track led to a program that Hargrove referred to by a designation number that Drake didn't recognize, which he suspected was intentional. She had operated under that program for 7 years. Long-range precision, covert insertion, intelligence-adjacent work that required the kind of patience and control that most people couldn't maintain for a week, let alone years. Her operational record covered 3 geographic theaters. The specifics remained classified, but Hargrove released enough to establish shape and scale, not a career built on paperwork and training cycles, but on the kind of decisions where the wrong answer didn't give you a chance to reconsider. She had been, in the particular language of the community, exceptionally good at it, and then 14 months ago, she had stopped. Hargrove was careful about how he described what happened. He used clinical language, operational trauma response, extended recovery protocol, voluntary transition to reduced visibility status. And the clinical language had the specific quality of words chosen to protect someone, which Drake found more informative than the words themselves. Something had happened 14 months ago. The record didn't say what because the record had been cleaned. But Hargrove was here, in Nevada, in a facility he had no operational reason to visit, drinking terrible coffee from a hallway machine. That was its own kind of statement. Master Chief Vale requested the reduced visibility assignment personally, Hargrove said. She identified this facility as a viable option based on its operational tempo and geographic location. The request was approved. She chose Black Ridge, Drake said. Yes. Why here specifically? Hargrove looked at Vale. Vale was looking at the table. That's not relevant to the current review, Hargrove said. Drake filed that as an answer. The second part of the debrief was harder. Hargrove turned to the documentation Drake and Cross had provided. The incident log from the past 2 days, the complaint from Ritter, the witness statements from range personnel. He read through it with the methodical attention of someone assembling a case rather than reviewing a report. And when he was done, he set it on the table and looked at Cross. 9 separate incidents of inappropriate conduct, he said, in 48 hours. Yes, sir. 3 from personnel under your direct command, 2 from instructors in Drake's training program. The remainder, general culture. He closed the folder. The complaint from Petty Officer First Class Ritter. I've already reviewed it, sir. He initiated physical contact. Yes, sir. He has been in this training rotation for how long? 14 months. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. I want him in front of a formal board, not for the contact, for the pattern that led to it. A service member who responds to demonstrated competence with aggression has a problem that will manifest again in a different context. He looked at Drake. That's your recommendation to make, Chief, but it's my strong advisement. Drake nodded. Understood, sir. The others? Hargrove looked at the list. Formal reprimands, documented, not buried. He set the list down. Commander Cross. Cross straightened. Your physical contact with a superior officer, regardless of the circumstances of the assignment, Master Chief Vale holds a rank that supersedes your own, will be formally documented in your record. Yes, sir. A board will review the incident. Given the circumstances, including the information gap created by the reduced visibility billet, I will be submitting a statement on those mitigating factors. The outcome of the review is not mine to predetermine. He paused. I'll say this clearly. The information gap was a command failure above your level, and that will be part of the record. But the physical contact was a choice, and choices have documentation. I understand, sir. Do you have anything to say? Cross looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Hargrove. I made assumptions about who she was based on what her billet said and how she presented. I treated those assumptions as facts. I was wrong. She paused. That's on me, not on the billet. Hargrove held her gaze for a moment. He nodded once, then he turned to Vale. Is there anything you want formally on record regarding your treatment in this facility? Vale was quiet for a moment. Drake watched her consider it. The specific consideration of someone who has the standing to make things difficult for a number of people and is deciding whether that serves anything. No, sir, she said. I want it documented that the instructor's conduct was inappropriate and that it should be addressed in training culture review. I don't want personal action against individuals beyond what's already outlined. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. You're sure? The facility should change, she said. The people can do that themselves. Hargrove called a break at 11:30. His aide brought actual food from somewhere, sandwiches in a cooler, which improved the atmosphere considerably. Drake stepped outside and stood in the Nevada sun and ate half a sandwich and thought about things he couldn't straighten out in his head. Garrett found him there. Garrett had apparently been waiting at a respectful distance, which was respectful of him. Flag presence, Garrett said. Yes. Full debrief? Ongoing. Garrett ate in silence for a moment. He was a man who could be quiet when the situation required it, which Drake had always respected about him. I want to ask you something, Garrett said. Ask. The planning room scenario, when she said the rule changes when the rule gets you killed. He paused. That wasn't theory. No. She's made that call. Almost certainly. Garrett looked at the range. At lane 7 in the distance. When she ran the assessment, the stage 6, when she found the zero shift. Most shooters, even good ones, they get angry or flustered. She just fixed it. Yes. Because she's had equipment fail in the field. Drake didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Garrett was quiet for another moment. I said some things on the first day, when the word spread about the first shot, before I knew anything. He stopped. You didn't say them to her directly. Doesn't matter. Drake looked at him. Garrett was staring at lane 7 with the specific expression of someone taking inventory of something they wish they could return. When this is done, Drake said, there's going to be a conversation with the whole training group. You'll have a chance to be part of that. Yeah, Garrett said. He didn't sound particularly comforted. They ate the rest of their sandwiches in silence. The debrief resumed at noon, and Hargrove shifted to something Drake hadn't expected. There's a service member I need to bring in, Hargrove said. He looked at his aide, who opened the conference room door. The man who came in was in army dress uniform, ranger tab, combat patches, the kind of service record you could read across a room without asking. He was mid-30s, brown-haired, with the particular physical quality of someone who had been very fit for a very long time and had the wear marks to prove it. He stopped just inside the door. His eyes went to Vale. He went very still. Drake had seen that kind of stillness before, not in training, but in the moments after something significant happened on a range, when someone was trying to process information their body had received before their mind could catch up. Master Sergeant Lucas Mercer, Hargrove said. Army Ranger, currently assigned to the Joint Training Coordination Office. He paused. He asked to be here. Mercer hadn't moved. He was looking at Vale with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously, recognition and something that was harder to name, the look of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just encountered the destination. She doesn't know me, Mercer said. To Hargrove, but his eyes didn't move. She won't know who I am. Master Sergeant, Hargrove said, why don't you tell her? Mercer came further into the room. He stopped at a respectful distance, not military distance, something more personal than that. About 11 years ago, he said. His voice was level, the tone of a man who had rehearsed this and was delivering it anyway because rehearsal was the only way he'd gotten through the door. My patrol, 8 Rangers, Kunar Province. We were moving on an exfil route that had been compromised. We didn't know that yet. He paused. We walked into an L-shaped ambush, classic. We had no egress. Our air support was 20 minutes out, and we were going to be dead in 5. The room was quiet. Contact came from 3 sides. We took casualties in the first 30 seconds. He paused again. And then it stopped. Not because they broke off. Not because our support arrived. He looked at Vale. Because someone started engaging the ambush element from a position that shouldn't have been possible. Angle of fire, distance, the rate of engagement. Our RTO tried to raise the shooter on every frequency we had. No response. 7 contacts eliminated in under 2 minutes. The remaining element withdrew. He exhaled. 8 Rangers walked out of that valley. We had 2 wounded. We should all have been dead. He stopped. Vale was looking at him with an expression that Drake could not quite categorize. Not unmoved. Something had shifted in her face. Something that was very carefully not being displayed, which was its own kind of display. I spent a year trying to find out who was on that ridge, Mercer said. The official record said there was no friendly asset in that area. No operation, no patrol, no overwatch element. He paused. I eventually stopped asking because every time I asked, I got very politely told to stop asking. He looked at Vale. Was it you? He said. Not a question. The way you say something when you already know the answer and you need to hear it from the source. Vale held his gaze for a long moment. You survived, she said. That's all that mattered. Mercer's jaw moved. I was holding something. Not grief, something more complicated than grief. The specific emotion of a debt you've been carrying so long it's become structural. There were 8 of us, he said. I know. You knew the names? I had the patrol manifest. It was part of the operation brief. She paused. I knew who was in the valley. Mercer put his hand over his mouth briefly. It was a gesture that on a different man might have been dramatic, but on him it was purely involuntary, the body overriding the professional training that would have kept it contained. He got it back in about 3 seconds. Thank you, he said. The words came out simple and stripped of everything except what they meant. Vale looked at him for a moment. Then she said, How's your shoulder? The left one. Mercer blinked. How did you... You were favoring it when you came in the door. I wasn't sure if it was old or recent. Old, he said. Shrapnel, same operation. Took a fragment in the deltoid. A pause. It gives me trouble when it's cold. Nevada's warm, she said. Something happened in Mercer's face then. Not a smile, but the precursor to one. The kind of thing that surfaces when the emotional content of a moment is too complicated to express any other way. He let out a breath. Yes, he said. It is. Drake stepped out while Mercer was composing himself and didn't step back in for 10 minutes. He stood in the hallway and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Kunar province and 8 rangers and a ridge that shouldn't have had anyone on it. Garrett was in the hallway when Drake came out. Apparently he'd been listening through the door, which Drake was going to pretend not to know about. 11 years, Garrett said. Yes. She was on that ridge 11 years ago. Apparently. Garrett was quiet, then, how old is she? Drake did the math. 37, maybe 38. So she was 26, 27 in Kunar. Something like that. Garrett leaned against the wall. He had a look on his face that Drake recognized. It was the specific look of someone being confronted with information that forces a recalibration of an assumption they'd held so long they'd forgotten it was an assumption. The things that were said on the first day, Garrett said. When people laughed. Yes. She heard all of it. She was there. Garrett pushed off the wall and walked down the hallway without another word. Drake didn't follow him. He'd seen enough of Garrett's process today to know the man was working through something that didn't need company. Oh. Hargrove came out of the conference room at 1400 with the folder under his arm and his aide 2 steps behind. Drake fell in beside him as he walked toward the main range. The review board timeline, Drake said. 60 days for the formal findings. The reprimands will be processed through your command. Ritter's board is separate and goes through the selection pipeline command. You'll coordinate with them. Cross? Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Cross did something wrong, and she said so clearly and without trying to shift it. That matters. The review board will weigh it. He paused. She's a capable commander. What happened here was a failure of information and a failure of assumption. Both of those can be fixed. Drake nodded. They stopped at the entrance to the main range area. Lane 7 was visible in the middle distance. The covered firing position, the long gravel berm, the electronic target board still showing the last score from 2 days ago. The function test shot, Drake said. Yes? She told me she just didn't want to fire a round into dirt if there was a legitimate aiming point. Hargrove looked at Lane 7. Something in his expression was complicated in a way Drake couldn't fully read. Part of it was something close to pride, but under that was something heavier. That's her, Hargrove said. She can't quite turn it off. Even when she's trying to disappear, the fundamentals surface. He paused. It's why she came here. She thought a precision facility would feel familiar without being operational. He stopped. I think she underestimated how visible she'd be once she pulled that trigger. Why did she want to disappear? Drake said. He kept his voice level, professional, not demanding, just asking. Hargrove looked at him. Her partner, he said. 14 months ago. Classified operation. Things went wrong in a way they rarely go wrong. She got out. Her partner didn't. A pause. His name was Senior Chief Aaron Goss. They'd worked together for 6 years. Drake said nothing. She blames herself, Hargrove said. There's no rational basis for it. The investigation was clean. The decision she made in those seconds was correct by every standard we have. But rational basis doesn't do much for that kind of grief. He looked at Lane 7. So she asked for a quiet posting. She wanted to be somewhere she could breathe without everything reminding her of what she'd lost. He paused. And then she fired a function test round into a target at 1,400 yards, and here we are. Drake looked at the range. Here we are, he said. Cross found Vale at the armory at 1500. Vale was running the end-of-day check-in, which was her job and which she was apparently going to continue doing, which Cross found she could not quite look at directly without something shifting in her chest in an uncomfortable way. She stood at the counter. Vale looked up. I want to say something, Cross said. Okay. Not as a commander, not for the record. Cross paused. I owe you an apology that's separate from what I said in the debrief. What I said in there was accurate, and it was formal, and it was... She stopped. It wasn't enough. What I did this morning was wrong in a way that the formal language doesn't cover. I put my hands on you because I wanted to establish authority over someone I thought was beneath me. And that is... She stopped again. Vale waited. I've spent 15 years building a career on treating service members fairly, Cross said. I believe I've generally done that. And in 48 hours I demonstrated that I have a limit on that, and the limit turns out to be someone who doesn't fit the category I expected them to fit. She looked at the counter. I don't have an excuse for that. I have an explanation, and the explanation isn't an excuse. Vale was quiet for a moment. She set down the clipboard. Commander Cross, she said, I've been in enough facilities, worked under enough command structures, to know the difference between someone who has a bad day and someone who has a bad character. She paused. You have a bad 2 days. That's a different category. Cross held her gaze. I'm not sure you owe me that. I'm not offering it as a debt. I'm just telling you what I see. Vale picked up the clipboard again. Your facility has a culture problem. You can fix that. The Admiral's review will help, but the review doesn't fix the culture. You do. The way you talk, the way you run briefings, the assumptions you let stand without challenging them. She paused. You fix those things, and the review becomes background noise. Cross was quiet. She was looking at Vale with the careful attention of someone who has moved past defensiveness into something more honest. Why are you telling me this? Cross said. Because you asked for something real, and I gave you something real. Vale shrugged slightly. It's how I talk to people. Cross stood at the counter for another moment. Then she nodded. A small, deliberate motion that carried more weight than a nod usually did. Thank you, she said. She left without adding anything. God. Drake found Vale later, at close of day, at the Lane 7 firing position. She was sitting on the bench at the covered firing point, not with a rifle, just sitting, looking down the range. The evening light had gotten long and thin, the kind of Nevada evening light that turned everything amber and made the distance look closer than it was. He sat down on the bench beside her. Not close, not far. For a while, neither of them said anything. Goss, Drake said. He kept it simple. One word, leaving space around it. She was quiet for a moment. The Admiral told you. Some of it. She looked at the range. The target board at 1,400 yards was a small rectangle in the amber light. He was better than me, she said. At most things. Not at the shooting. We were even on that. But at the rest of it, the patience, the ability to be in a situation and not let the situation get inside him. A pause. I used to watch how he handled things and try to learn it. I never quite did. Drake said nothing. The last operation, she said. It went wrong in one specific moment, one decision point, and I made the right call. Everyone agrees on that, the review board, the after action, all of it. The right call. She stopped. He died because of it. And every piece of analysis says there was no other option, and I did what needed to be done, and that's... She stopped again. It doesn't sit flat. No, Drake said. It never sits flat. She looked at him. I lost someone, he said. Different context. Instructor, not operational. But the math feels the same afterward. You go back over it, and you can prove to yourself every time that you did what you could, and it never stops feeling like you could have done something different. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the range. I came here because it was quiet, she said, and because it felt like the kind of place where I could be near the work without being in it. Near the thing I'm good at without... She stopped. Without the cost of it. And then you fired a function test. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. The wind was 18 knots and the target was there. I couldn't just fire into dirt. No, Drake said. I don't think you could. The sun dropped behind the western berm, and the amber light went gray quickly, the way it does in the desert, and the range settled into the particular quiet of end of day. Equipment stored, lanes cleared, the hum of the electronic systems winding down. Hargrove wants me to consider going back, Vale said. Not to Drake specifically, more like saying it out loud to see how it sounded. Not immediately, but a formal reassignment, operational track. Drake thought about that. What do you want? She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the range lights came on automatically, their soft glow pushing back the early dark. I want Goss to be alive, she said. That's the only thing I've wanted for 14 months. Drake sat with that. After that, she said, I don't know yet. Hargrove's aide appeared at the far end of the range, picking his way across the gravel. He stopped at a respectful distance and waited. Vale noticed him. She stood up. There's a mission, she said. It wasn't a question. He mentioned something to you? Not directly, but Whitfield's visit this morning wasn't a routine review. She paused. And Mercer being here, Hargrove doesn't bring people for emotional closure. He brings them when the context is relevant. Drake looked at her. You already know what it is. I have a good guess, she said. She looked at the aide, then back at the range one more time. At lane 7. At the target board, small and precise at the far end, sitting in the pale wash of the range lights. 1,400 yards, Drake said. She looked at it. Not a bad function test, she said. She walked toward the aide, and Drake sat on the bench and watched her go. And the Nevada night came in around the range lights, and somewhere across the facility, a radio crackled with the end-of-day traffic, and the target board at the end of lane 7 held its last recorded score in the pale electric light, patient and exact, the way certain truths wait before they're ready to be seen. Hargrove's aide was a young lieutenant named Cho, who had clearly been briefed to be patient and was executing that briefing with visible effort. He stood at the edge of the range gravel with his hands clasped behind his back and waited while Vale covered the distance between the firing position and where he stood, and when she arrived he simply said, The Admiral would like a few minutes, Master Chief. Conference room, when you're ready. Give me 10, she said. She went to the armory instead, unlocked it, went inside, and stood at the cleaning station without touching anything for about 3 minutes. The room smelled like solvent and metal and the particular dry nothing of a space that got used constantly but never quite felt inhabited. She had spent 4 months in this room. She had learned the serial numbers of 47 rifles. She had filed more inventory paperwork than she had filed in the previous 7 years of her career combined. She had also slept more nights in a row than she had managed in the 14 months before she arrived. She pulled her personal kit from the locker, the small weathered notebook, the Allen wrench, a field compass that was old enough that the markings had faded on 2 of the cardinal points, and a photograph she kept between the notebook's back cover and its last page. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Aaron Goss, squinting into strong sunlight somewhere that was not Nevada, with the expression of a man who had just said something that made himself laugh. She had taken the photo. She remembered the exact moment. A transit layover, a tarmac somewhere in the Pacific, 3 hours before a flight that would take them to a situation that turned out to be more complicated than the brief suggested. He had been good at laughing. That was the thing she found herself missing that she hadn't expected to miss. Not the operational competence, not the 6 years of accumulated shorthand, but the specific quality of his laugh, which was sudden and genuine and occasionally completely inappropriate to the situation. She put the photograph back between the pages. She locked the locker, turned off the lights, and went to see the Admiral. Hargrove was alone in the conference room. His aide had been sent somewhere else, which Vale took as a signal that this conversation was off the record, in the way that some of Hargrove's most important conversations were off the record. She sat down across from him. He had a cup of the terrible coffee in front of him and was apparently on his third, which told her something about his evening. The mission, she said. I'm going to tell you about it, he said. And then I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer, not a professional answer, an honest one. Okay. He set the cup down. Sierra Goss, Aaron's daughter, 18 years old. She was doing NGO work in the northern highlands of a country I can't name in an unrecorded conversation. Small medical operation, 3-person team, delivering supplies to villages that don't have road access. He paused. 2 weeks ago, the team was intercepted by a non-state armed group operating in that area. 2 members of the team were released within 48 hours. Sierra wasn't. Vale was very still. We have a locational fix that's 46 hours old, Hargrove said. It's degrading. The group moves on irregular patterns, and the terrain makes aerial surveillance unreliable. He paused. There is an extraction plan. It's a small element, 4 people, because 4 people can move in that terrain where 10 can't. The element needs a long-range precision component because there is one passage point on the exfil route that is overlooked by a ridge position, and if the group has a sentry element at that position, the extraction team cannot pass without being observed and engaged. How far is the ridge from the passage point? Vale said. 1,100 yards. Variable wind, east-facing slope, afternoon thermal activity. She looked at him. I know, he said. Who's leading the extraction element? Mercer. She absorbed that. That's why he was here. He asked for you specifically. He made the request before I decided to come here. He'd been looking informally for some time. When Whitfield's report came in about Black Ridge, Mercer connected the dots faster than most people would. He's good, she said. Yes, and he trusts you in a way that's hard to build from scratch, which matters for an element that's going in with a 46-hour-old locational fix and a degrading window. Vale looked at the table, at the coffee ring that had dried on the surface from a previous meeting, at her own hands, which were steady, which they usually were. The honest question, she said. Are you ready? He paused. Not operationally. I've read the assessment results. I know what Drake ran you through. I'm not asking if you can still shoot. He paused again. I'm asking if you're ready to be back in a situation where the decisions are real and the cost of the wrong decision is a person who doesn't come home. The room was quiet. Sierra is Aaron's daughter, Vale said. Yes. He has a son too, Thomas, 14. Yes. Aaron used to talk about them, not often. He was careful about that, keeping the personal separate, but sometimes on long transits, he'd talk about them. She looked at her hands. Sierra wanted to be a doctor. He was proud of that. She stopped. He was scared for her, the way parents are scared for kids who are brave. Hargrove said nothing. If I don't go, Vale said. Who's the precision element? There are other options. None with your specific background in that terrain type and at that distance window. That's not an answer. There are other options, he said again. They're adequate. She heard what adequate meant. She had been adequate a few times in her career, and she had watched adequate fall short in conditions that required something more than adequate. She thought about the ridge. 1,100 yards, east-facing slope, afternoon thermals. She had made longer shots in worse conditions. She had made shots like that from positions that required 4 hours of approach and absolute silence and the ability to hold still long enough that her body temperature equalized with the ground beneath her. She thought about Aaron Goss laughing on a Pacific tarmac. She thought about 8 rangers walking out of a Kunar province valley that they should not have walked out of. I'm ready, she said. Not loudly. Not with any particular drama. The way you say a thing when you've been circling it for 14 months and have finally arrived at the center of it and found that the center is just a fact. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Mission brief is at 0400, he said. Wheels up at 06. I need to talk to Drake first, she said. He'll be up. Drake was, in fact, still at the range. He had moved from the bench at Lane 7 to the instructor's shack, where he was sitting with a cup of his own terrible coffee and the facility's incident log open in front of him, writing things down in the careful, methodical way he did when he was trying to make sense of something that wasn't quite making sense yet. Vale knocked on the open door. He looked up. Sit down, he said. She sat. 0600 departure, she said. I won't be completing the armory inventory cycle. I'll find someone. The Remington in Bay 4 has a hairline crack in the stock that I flagged 3 weeks ago and which has not been addressed. It needs to go to depot before it's issued again. I'll make sure it does. She looked at the incident log. The review board documentation. I'll handle it. Ritter? Board convenes in 30 days. Pipeline command is already aware. He paused. He's not a bad operator. He made bad choices. Those are fixable things if he lets them be fixed. She looked at the window. At the dark outside, the range lights visible in the distance. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. When you first heard the shot, on Lane 7, Before you knew anything about who fired it. She paused. What did you think? Drake considered the question. I thought it was a malfunction report, a training aid misfiring, something mechanical. And when you saw the score? I thought it was Okafor. I thought he'd come back from leave and nobody had updated the lane schedule. And when you saw it was me, he was quiet for a moment. I thought someone had made a significant mistake, he said. Not you, me, and how I'd been running this facility. She looked at him. 17 years, he said. I've run this program for 3 years specifically, and I've run programs like it for longer than that. And it took a function test round in a maintenance window to make me realize I'd been evaluating people by their packaging. He paused. That's not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. It's a useful thing to know. That's one way to look at it. She stood up. He stood up too, which was a reflex rather than a decision. I need to ask you something, Drake said. Ask. The soil composition question in the tactical planning scenario. He paused. I've run that problem for 3 years. You were the first person to ask that. Okay. How did you know to ask it? She looked at him for a moment. Then, because I once lost a shot due to bipod shift on sandy soil that I hadn't accounted for. The round went 14 inches wide at 900 yards. She paused. The target survived. He shouldn't have. She looked at the window. I don't lose shots the same way twice. Drake nodded. He held out his hand. She shook it. Good luck, Master Chief, he said. Thanks for the coffee, she said. Both days. Even though it was terrible. He laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that he hadn't planned. It left the room feeling slightly less heavy than it had been. She walked out into the Nevada night. At 0200, while the facility slept, Drake did something he almost never did. He walked the full perimeter of the training range alone, without a purpose beyond the walking. He went past the pistol lanes and the CQB structure, and the movement corridors, and the long gravel path that led to Lane 7. He stopped at the Lane 7 firing position and stood in the dark. The target board was off. Power saving mode after midnight. He couldn't see the score anymore. Just the outline of the structure at the far end of the berm, a dark rectangle against the darker sky. He thought about what it costs to be that good and keep it to yourself. He thought about 14 months of silence and inventory logs and a photograph between notebook pages. He thought about Aaron Goss, whom he'd never met, and the specific weight of a person shaped by grief who still walked toward the thing that caused the grief, because walking away from it wasn't something she knew how to do. He went back to his quarters and wrote 3 more pages of notes, and when he was done, he started drafting something that wasn't a report. It was more like a proposal, addressed to the Naval Special Warfare Training Command, about how the precision program at Black Ridge evaluated personnel and what needed to change and why. He worked on it until the sky started going pale in the east. The morning briefing with the training group happened at 0700, after Vale's transport had already lifted off. Drake ran it himself. He put the incident log on the table and stood in front of the assembled instructors and operators and support staff, all of them, every billet. And he talked for 40 minutes without notes. He didn't name names beyond what the formal record already contained. He didn't editorialize. He described what had happened over 2 days in plain and specific language. And he described what had been learned, and he described what would change. He said, "This facility has a culture that evaluates people by what they appear to be rather than what they are. I have contributed to that culture. I am telling you now, directly, that it ends." He said, "You will be assessed on your professional conduct toward every service member in this facility, regardless of billet, regardless of rank, regardless of whether that person looks like what you expect an operator to look like." He said, "If you believe the work you do gives you the right to treat support personnel as lesser, if you have been operating on that belief, I want you to sit with the fact that the person you laughed at on Lane 7 had more confirmed operational experience than most of this room combined." Nobody spoke. "Questions," he said. Nobody had questions. Or rather, everyone had questions, but none of them were the kind that could be asked in a briefing, which meant they would be processed privately, which was fine. Private processing was how most real change actually happened. Garrett raised his hand after a long pause. "What do we do with it?" "With what?" "All of it. The 2 days. The way we handled it." Drake looked at him. "You do better," starting today. That's the only available option. Garrett nodded and put his hand down. Check. Ritter came to Drake's office at 1100. He came alone, which Drake noted. He knocked on the open door and stood in the door frame. I want to make a statement for the board record, Ritter said. That happens through the formal process. You'll have an opportunity. I know, I wanted to say it to you first. He paused. I put my hand on her because I was threatened by something I didn't understand. That's the truth of it. Not the way I would have described it 2 days ago, but that's what it was. He paused again. I don't know how to fix that yet. I know I need to. Drake looked at him for a long moment. Ritter was a man who was genuinely good at his job and genuinely unfinished as a person, which described a lot of people in this business and didn't disqualify any of them from getting better. The board is a process, Drake said. The process will do what it does. What you do with the result is up to you. Yes, sir. Ritter. Sir. She said she didn't want personal action against individuals beyond what was outlined. He paused. I thought you should know that. Ritter stood there for a moment. Something moved across his face. The complicated expression of a person receiving a generosity that makes the original offense feel heavier rather than lighter. That's... He stopped. Yeah, he said. Just that. He left. Drake went back to his proposal. The mission brief had been at 0400, and the flight had been long enough that Vale slept for part of it, which she hadn't expected. She woke over a coastline she didn't recognize from the air and spent the remaining transit time going through the operational package with Mercer, who sat across from her in the transport and talked through the terrain like someone who had been studying it for a long time. He had. She could tell by the way he knew the elevation contours without looking at the map. The ridge position, she said. What's the approach? 3 hours from the insert point. Mostly uphill. The last 300 meters are exposed scree. We'll need to go before first light to get to the firing position before the thermals build. Wind at that altitude? Variable until about 0800, then consistent north-northeast, 8 to 12 knots. You'll have about a 40-minute window before thermal activity makes the upper atmosphere unreliable. She looked at the terrain map. The passage point was narrow, a natural corridor between two ridgelines where the extraction team would have no choice but to move through and file. If a sentry element was watching from the high ground, the corridor was a killing box. The locational fix, she said, 46 hours old. We have a secondary source that updated 8 hours ago. Lower confidence, but it corroborates the primary. He paused. She's there. Vale looked at the map. Aaron used to talk about her, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things come out in transit, when you're between places and the normal filters are slightly down. Mercer was quiet for a moment. He talked about you too, he said. In the Ranger community, after Kunar, your name circulated. Nobody knew it was you specifically. Nobody knew your name. But the description of what happened on that ridge, it got around. He paused. He knew it was you. She looked up. He never said it directly, Mercer said. But about 8 months before he died, we were at a joint training coordination meeting in Coronado. We had dinner afterward. He said, Mercer paused, selecting the words carefully. He said he was glad his partner had done something that mattered beyond the operation they were running, that she'd done something that was just right. Separate from the mission, separate from the orders, just right. He paused. He was talking about Kunar. I didn't understand it at the time, I do now. Vale looked at the terrain map for a long time. He was better at the human parts than I was, she said. He always saw the edges of a thing that I was focused too tightly to see. Maybe, Mercer said, or maybe you see them too and you just don't say them. She didn't answer that, but she didn't disagree. The transport began its descent, and below them the terrain was rough and green and very far from Nevada, and somewhere in it a girl who had wanted to be a doctor was waiting in a circumstance she had not planned for. And the people coming for her were 4, because 4 could move where 10 could not. And one of them had spent 14 months in a maintenance inventory room trying to breathe without the thing that breathing reminded her of. The approach to the ridge took 3 hours and 20 minutes, which was 20 minutes longer than Mercer's estimate, because the scree in the final section was looser than the terrain analysis had indicated. Vale went up it on her hands and knees for the last 50 meters, the rifle slung across her back, finding handholds in the dark, with the patience of someone who had done this enough times that patience was no longer a virtue she had to choose. It was just the mode she operated in. She reached the firing position at 0540. Mercer and the two other element members held at the ridge's reverse slope while she set up. The position was a natural depression in the rock, barely large enough for a prone shooter and minimal equipment. She got behind the rifle and looked through the scope at a sky that was just beginning to separate from dark into the particular gray of early morning that has light in it without being light yet. The passage point was visible, barely, at this magnification, at this distance, a narrow throat of ground between two masses of ridge. She looked at the wind. No flags here, no sensors. Just the movement of the vegetation on the slope below the passage point and the way the ambient air felt at this altitude, and the thermal activity starting in the warming rock faces to the east. She worked through the ballistics in her head, not with hesitation, the way a musician works through a piece they've played 1,000 times. The numbers came clean and settled. She waited. The extraction team moved at first light. She tracked the passage point through the scope, while Mercer's element moved through terrain below her, and when the sentry element appeared on the far ridge, two of them, exactly where the brief had assessed they might be, she was already there, already holding, already accounting for the 1,100 yards and the north-northeast wind at 9 knots and the thermal shimmer beginning at the lower altitude. The extraction team was 40 seconds from the passage point. She made 2 shots. The interval between them was 4 seconds, because 4 seconds was what the follow-through on the first shot and the target acquisition on the second required, and she did not rush it, and she did not hesitate. 4 seconds was what it took, and she gave it exactly 4 seconds. The extraction team moved through the passage point. She was already moving off the ridge before they cleared the far side. They were wheels up with Sierra Goss inside the target window. The girl was thin and frightened and had a cut above her eyebrow that had been dressed with what looked like a torn piece of cloth and was going to need proper attention. She sat in the transport with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and looked at the 4 people who had come for her with the specific expression of someone whose mind has not yet entirely caught up with the fact that they are safe. Mercer sat beside her and talked to her quietly. He was good at that, the human part. He had the patience for it that the work required, and that not everyone who did the work possessed. Vale sat across from them, rifle between her knees, and watched the girl's face move from frightened to uncertain to something that was not quite relief yet but was in the direction of it. She watched Sierra look out the transport window at the terrain falling away below and take the first breath that didn't have fear in the bottom of it. She thought about Aaron Goss. She thought about him seeing this. She thought about what he would have said, probably something that made her laugh, probably something that made the enormity of the moment smaller and more manageable, the way he always did, the way she had never quite learned and had spent years watching him do. She thought he would have been glad, not proud, glad. There was a difference. Pride was about the accomplishment. Gladness was about the person on the other side of it, about Sierra with a thermal blanket and a cut above her eyebrow breathing her first unafraid breath in 2 weeks. Aaron would have been glad. Vale allowed herself quietly and without showing it to be glad too. She was back at Black Ridge 11 days later. Not because she was required to be. Hargrove had offered her the option of a direct transition to the operational track. New assignment, new posting. The reduced visibility billet formally closed. She had asked for 2 weeks instead. She had some things she wanted to finish. Drake was at the range office when she arrived. He had the proposal on his desk, refined now, 30 pages, with supporting data and a formal recommendation structure. I was going to submit it to the training command that week. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. Something in his face shifted. The particular relief of a person who had been waiting for confirmation of a good outcome without knowing when it would come. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," she said. He looked at her. "Really fine? Or polite fine?" "Really fine." He nodded. He looked at his desk. "I've been drafting something." She came in and read the first page of the proposal. She read the second. She set it down. "The section on evaluation criteria," she said. "You should include a specific provision about billet assumptions. The assumption that someone's billet defines the ceiling of their capability. Already in Section 4. And something about how the culture responds to demonstrated competence from unexpected sources, whether it accepts it or tries to explain it away." Section 6. She looked at him. "You've been busy." I had some things to think about. He paused. The Remington and Bay 4 went to depot. Good. Also, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small object and set it on the desk between them. A challenge coin, well used, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. The face showed a precision crosshair and an insignia she didn't recognize immediately, which meant it was unit-specific, which meant it had been earned rather than issued. Goss's? She said. No, mine. From my second team, long time ago. I lost a teammate in a training accident and I carried it for a while. Then I gave it to a junior instructor who reminded me that the work matters regardless of what it costs. He pushed it slightly toward her. You can do what you want with it. She picked it up, turned it over. The back had a date stamped into it. She put it in her breast pocket next to the weathered notebook. The instructors, she said. The training group. How are they? Working through it. Garrett's been running voluntary culture discussions on Friday afternoons. Attendance is better than I expected. He paused. Ritter went before the board last week. Accepted formal reprimand without dispute. He asked to write a letter. To me? He gave it to me to pass on. I told him that was your decision to make. Where is it? Drake opened his desk drawer again and removed an envelope. Plain standard issue, Ritter's name printed in the top left corner. She took it, didn't open it, put it in her cargo pocket. I'll read it, she said. Not a promise, just a statement of intent. She spent the 2 weeks doing what she had come to Black Ridge to do in the first place, being near the work without being in it, letting the precision and the distance and the specific silence of a long-range course do what silence does when you let it. She ran the range every morning. Not the assessment course, just the basic lanes, working through fundamentals with the focused attention of a musician running scales. She let herself be visible in a way she hadn't been in the 4 months before the function test. She ate in the cafeteria at regular hours. She answered questions when people asked them, which they did, carefully at first, then with more directness as the days passed. She talked to Tran one afternoon, at the medical station, while Tran redressed a minor scrape on Vale's forearm she'd gotten on the range. The shrapnel scar, Tran said. She was working carefully, not looking up. I saw it the first week you were here, I told Drake. I know, Vale said. He mentioned it. I should have said something to you directly. You told the right person. Tran looked up briefly. I wasn't sure what to do with what I saw. I knew it meant something. I didn't know what. It meant I was in a place I shouldn't have been, closer than I'd planned to be, and I got lucky. Vale looked at the scar. It's not a heroic story. I made a miscalculation on an approach route and paid for it in shrapnel and about 8 weeks of recovery. Aaron Goss? Tran said, and then stopped immediately. Sorry, I overheard some of the debrief. I shouldn't have… It's fine, Vale said. No, that wasn't him. Different operation, earlier. She paused. He would have made a joke about it. He had a thing about scars. He thought they were the body's editorial comments on your decision-making. Tran laughed. A genuine, surprised laugh. Vale looked at the scar. He wasn't wrong, Ichat. On the last morning, she went to lane 7 before anyone else was on the range. She didn't bring a rifle. She sat on the bench at the covered firing position and looked down the course as the desert light came in from the east, amber and thin, the way it came in every morning here. The target board was on. Someone had run a calibration check the previous evening and left it active. It was displaying the same score it had been displaying for 2.5 weeks now. Her score from the function test, the round she'd fired because she didn't want to fire into dirt. 1,400 yards. Center bullseye. No deviation recorded. She sat with it for a while. She thought about the 14 months in the armory, the inventory logs, the nights that were better than the ones before, the slow and unglamorous process of putting something back together that had come apart in a way that had no clean edges. She thought about how it had felt to sit in this same position on the first day and settle behind a rifle that wasn't her rifle and feel the wind and make the adjustment and fire the round, and how it had not felt like anything in particular in the moment, just the work, just the familiar geometry of a thing she had done thousands of times, and how that familiarity had been, without her quite knowing it, the thing she had been looking for. She thought about Aaron Goss. She thought about him with the deliberate openness she'd been practicing, not trying to push it down and not trying to live in it, just letting the grief exist at its actual size, which was still very large but was no longer the only thing in the room. She thought about Sierra Goss, who was in a hospital in a city Vale couldn't name, being looked after by doctors who were finishing what Sierra had come to that country to learn. She would recover. She would probably, eventually, do the thing she had set out to do. Her father would have been glad. That word again. Glad. She was learning to use it. She heard footsteps on the gravel and turned to see Drake coming along the range path with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without being asked and sat down on the other end of the bench. The coffee was still terrible. "Last day," he said. "Yes." "New posting?" "Formal operational track. Start date in 3 weeks." "Good." They drank in silence for a while. The sun came fully above the eastern ridge, and the range lit up in the way it did in the mornings here, clean and sharp, every surface precise, the kind of light that made distances look exactly what they were. "The proposal went in yesterday," Drake said. "I know, Hargrove mentioned it." "He's supporting it." "Of course he is. It's good work." Drake looked sideways at her. "How do you know? You only read 2 pages." "2 pages was enough." He made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and an acknowledgement. "You're going to be fine," he said, not as encouragement, as a statement of observed fact. "I know," she said, also as a fact. Not because the grief was gone, it wasn't, and probably wouldn't be, not entirely, not ever in the way that would make the word gone accurate. But because she had sat in an armory for 4 months and a range bench for 2 weeks and learned something she had apparently needed to learn, which was that the work and the loss could coexist in the same person without one destroying the other. That she could still settle behind a rifle and feel the wind and make the adjustment and fire the round. That the thing she was good at had not died with the person who made her better at the human edges of it. That Aaron Goss would have been glad. She finished the coffee. She stood up. She looked one more time at the target board at the far end of lane 7. The score from the function test. Center bullseye, 1 round, 1,400 yards. She had fired it because she didn't want to fire into dirt. That was the whole story, and it was also not the whole story at all, which was how most things worked. She picked up her kit. "Chief Drake," she said. "Master Chief." She walked off lane 7 and across the gravel and through the main range gate, and the Nevada morning was clear and bright and very wide around her, and she did not look back because she had never been the kind of person who looked back when the direction she needed to go was forward. The target board held its score in the morning light, patient and exact, long after she was gone. The people who carry the most are often the ones who never